Think about how different your brain feels, when you're rushing against a deadline versus when you actually have time to sit back and think things through. Or maybe think about how a simple idea like balance applies not just to, say, standing upright, but to our health, to how whole societies function, and maybe even, well, even the whole cosmos. Today, we're doing a deep dive into some really fascinating, maybe challenging ideas. We're looking at Oscar Enrique Munoz's Mastering Mind, specifically Chapter 3, which is called A First Approach to Continuous Rationality. And this isn't just standard psychology, it's more philosophical, scientific even. It really gets you thinking differently about consciousness, what rational actually means, and maybe even life itself.
It really does. What's striking is how Munoz reframes rationality. It's not presented as just, cold logic, something only humans do. He pushes us to see its roots are much, much deeper, more fundamental, more ancient than we usually think. Which makes you wonder, doesn't it? What if what we call rational is just this tiny tip of the iceberg? A sliver of some vast intelligence that's, well, everywhere. So our mission today, if you like, is to explore that. How rationality isn't separate from emotions or survival, how it connects to this wider sense of order, maybe even cosmic order, and how it's this ongoing, continuous process, not just something humans invented.
Okay, so let's start with a core concept the author uses, homeostasis. Now, in biology, that's fairly straightforward, isn't it? It's how your body keeps everything stable inside, your temperature, blood sugar, pH levels, all that stuff. Even when things outside are changing like crazy, you're running, you haven't eaten, it's boiling hot or freezing cold, your body is doing this constant, intricate dance. It's this amazing ability of living things to keep their internal world pretty stable despite all the chaos outside. It's not static. It's not dynamic adjustment. Precisely. And that's the key. It is dynamic. When you think about the bigger picture, homeostasis isn't just about hitting certain numbers on a gauge. It's the absolute foundation of being alive. It's this essential self-regulation, this constant choreography, making sure everything stays within the necessary limits for life to even continue. Think about electrolytes in your cells, oxygen in your blood. If those go too far off balance, well, things go wrong very quickly. So this constant adaptive balancing act is literally what makes life possible. It lets organisms maintain themselves, keep going, in a universe that's always changing. It shows life's fundamental drive to just keep going.
Right, that makes total sense for, a single organism, a bacterium, a person, whatever.
Yeah.
But then Munoz expands this. He talks about entire societies having a kind of homeostasis. That feels like a huge jump in scale. How does he make that connection? What does it even mean for a whole community or society to be maintaining some kind of internal balance? Well, this is where it gets really insightful, I think. He argues that just like we talk about homeostasis for an individual body, we can apply the same kind of thinking to social organisms, to human groups. So sociocultural homeostasis would be this whole complex web of things a society does to keep its survival activities in balance. And importantly, these aren't always the most efficient processes, energetically speaking. Think about urban sprawl versus dense cities sprawl often isn't the most efficient, right? But these processes are always about adapting to the physical environment, adapting to new technology. It's all about adapting for collective survival, ensuring the group continues, even if the solutions seem complex or maybe not perfectly efficient by some narrow metric. It's like the societal version of your body adjusting its metabolism.
Okay, so societies are constantly adapting to stay healthy in a sense. And a really good example of this, I guess, would be how cities evolve, because they don't just spring up fully formed, do they?
Huh?
Early settlements, they just grew organically, right? Near water, good land. But then as more people moved in, things got dense, and that creates new problems. Sanitation, moving around, keeping order. So societies had to invent things. Complex urban planning, sewer systems to stop disease, roads for trade, public squares for people to meet. These weren't just nice ideas, they were essential adaptations.
Absolutely essential. And even if some of these adaptations weren't models of energy efficiency, like, again, the transport needed for suburbs, they were completely necessary to maintain order, public health, social cohesion, all the things you need for a large group of people living closely together. A city, viewed this way, is almost like a living thing itself, constantly adjusting its internal workings to keep its population thriving and stable. It's a really clear, ongoing example of this sociocultural homeostasis Munoz talks about. a drive for balance and continuity against constant change. It's not about reaching some perfect static state, but about that continuous adaptive adjustment to keep things going, to avoid collapse.
Okay, now this is where my mind really starts to stretch a bit, because it sounds like we're using biology as a metaphor for society. But the author goes further, doesn't he? He suggests this isn't just a metaphor. He's saying our cultural evolution, the way our societies change, can actually feed back and change our biology, our genes even. That this entanglement between cultural homeostasis and biological homeostasis is much deeper, more real than just a conceptual link. That sociocultural progress can actually weave itself into our genome.
It does raise a huge question, doesn't it? How much are our collective habits, our inventions, actually shaping who we become biologically? And Munoz gives this really powerful example, lactose tolerance. For most mammals, and for early humans too, the enzyme to digest milk, sugar, lactose, well, it switches off after infancy. Makes sense, right? You're weaned. But in some human populations, especially those with a long history of dairy farming, think parts of Europe, Africa, a genetic mutation popped up, and it spread. This mutation kept the lactase enzyme switched on for life. And this wasn't random. It's what we call gene culture coevolution. The cultural practice, dairy farming, created this intense pressure. If you could digest milk as an adult, you had this amazing source of nutrition, especially when other food was scarce. So people with the mutation had an advantage. They survived better, had more kids who likely inherited the gene. Over generations, the gene became common in those populations. So our cultural invention, raising cows for milk, literally changed our genetic code. It shows this incredible direct feedback loop. How we live shapes our biology, and maybe our biology shapes how we live too. All driven by that need for balance, survival, and continuity for the group.
Okay, so survival, this drive for continuity and balance seems absolutely central. And Munoz then makes this really strong claim. He says basically, in the grand scheme of evolution, the survival of the group comes before everything else, before any symbolic stuff like art or complex ideas. That group survival is the ultimate reference point. Everything else has to relate back to that fundamentally. How does he unpack that idea?
Well, emphasizes that how an organism fundamentally categorizes its world, what it sees as important, dangerous, valuable, all comes down to what worked for survival and adaptation in the past. So our core values, our deepest sense of good and bad, safe and dangerous, they emerge directly from these successful survival strategies, especially collective ones. So before we even get to complex thought, abstract ideas, art, religion, philosophy, the absolute first priority, the bedrock, is making sure the group keeps going. Everything else we build, all our symbols and meanings, ultimately has to answer to that fundamental need. It's like the ultimate evolutionary test. Any system of thought or culture that consistently undermines group survival, well, it just won't last, will it?
That's a really powerful framing. Survival as the ultimate judge of value. And then he connects this directly to our emotions. He argues feelings aren't just feelings, they are the actual foundation of how we make meaning. They came first, long before a complex reason. How does he explain that things like fear or joy are more than just subjective states, that they're actually cognitive processes that laid the groundwork for language and thought?
It's quite a perspective shift. He argues that our basic emotions provide the fundamental semantics, the core meaning for our language. They are cognitive processes that evolved way before our complex rational thinking did. They are, in a way, the raw material of meaning itself. Think about it. Before we had a word like danger, we had the feeling of fear. Before we could talk about community or well-being, we felt comfort or joy with others. These gut reactions are our first way of processing the world, sorting it into good for survival and bad for survival. They're not just reactions. They're our original framework for understanding anything at all. They tell us instantly, instinctively, what matters for staying alive.
Yeah, that clicks. Like a terrified scream or that sheer relief and joy of finding food when you're desperate. Those reactions feel incredibly old, much older than, say, writing an essay. And the author says they kick in super fast when things get real. These vital valuations, the raw, immediate sense of what helps or hurts, they're evolutionarily ancient, and they take precedence in critical moments. How exactly do they act as processes of maximal efficiency, as he puts it?
Right. In moments of intense pressure, emotions reveal their true nature as incredibly efficient processes. They effectively bypass the slower, more energy-hungry, deliberate thinking of our newer brain regions, the neocortex. Instead, they tap straight into our deepest, oldest memories and survival strategies, the species' accumulated wisdom, if you like to handle extreme boundary situations. Imagine our ancestors facing a predator. There's zero time for logical deduction about the odds. That immediate jolt of fear, of vital valuation, triggers fight, flight, or freeze instantly. It's not just a feeling. It's a highly efficient survival mechanism honed over millions of years. It forces rapid action based on what has historically worked in life or death scenarios. It's evolution's way of ensuring we react fast enough when it counts the most, prioritizing ancient wisdom over slow deliberation.
So, our sophisticated, logical brain, the part that does math, science, philosophy, it's great when everything's calm and stable. But when things get really stressful, when the pressure is immense, it's those older emotional systems that really take the wheel. The author points out that our fancy neocortical control, our capacity for formal reasoning, it only works reliably when we're not under overwhelming stress. It's not our default survival mode.
And that observation really makes you think, doesn't it? How much of what we consider our normal day-to-day rationality is actually dependent on things being relatively calm and safe. It suggests that our advanced reasoning is almost a kind of luxury, something we can afford when the environment is stable. But in those moments of real existential threat, the emotions step forward as these highly efficient processes. They access the species' deepest survival knowledge. When you're truly stressed or scared, that fear or anger isn't just noise interfering with your logic. It often becomes the primary driver, pulling from this ancient database of what works. It really shows the limits of pure formal reason when faced with the raw, immediate needs of just staying alive. It's a reminder that beneath our logical surface, there's a much older, faster system running the show when necessary, geared towards one thing: survival.
Okay, let's push this even further with this interesting thought experiment Munoz includes. He asks us to imagine an intelligent alien, right? But this alien only has one drive: seeking. That's it. No fear, no anger, no joy, no social bonds, totally asexual, non social, just seeking. Would we even be able to understand it? Could we recognize it as intelligent? How much does our idea of intelligence depend on shared emotions and social drives? He suggests we could only understand its seeking behaviors, nothing else.
Exactly. And exploring that idea really highlights his argument that often without realizing it, when we talk about intelligence, we're actually talking about life. Or more specifically, we're talking about life as it manifests through emotional systems: fear, seeking, care, anger, play, lust, all of them. We instinctively project our own emotional and social reality onto what we label as intelligent. We can't really conceive of an intelligence totally stripped of the emotional foundations that give our own lives meaning and drive. It's not just about empathy, it's deeper. It suggests our very concept of intelligence, our ability to even recognize it, is tied to our shared experiences, living, feeling, social beings driven by these fundamental emotional systems for survival and connection.
So, intelligence isn't just about solving puzzles or logic problems, then. That's too narrow. It's much broader. It's about adaptation, how well any living thing navigates its world, responds to challenges. And our complex formal reasoning, that's just a later development, a fancy outgrowth, and a narrow evolutionary development, he calls it, built on top of that older emotional and communication system. Can you unpack that term, eneric evolutionary development? What does eneric mean there?
Sure. Generic basically means something that's intrinsic, inherent, deeply embedded within the nature or evolution of something else. So when Munoz calls reason an generic evolutionary development of the emotive communicative system, he's saying it didn't just pop up separately from feelings and communication. It grew out of that older system from within it. There's a refinement, an advanced layer, but it's still fundamentally connected to its roots. So we see intelligence primarily as this adaptive capacity in all living things. Our methodical, formal reasoning is just one specific, highly developed part of that larger system. And this reframes reason, doesn't it? It's less the main driver of all our actions and more like a tool, a regulatory mechanism that works best in specific, perhaps simplified situations, like a precision instrument that's amazing in controlled conditions, but maybe less useful in a chaotic storm. It refines our adaptation within certain limits rather than being the source of adaptation itself.
Which brings us back to the emotions and this continuous rationality idea. The author argues that our logical thinking, how we use reason, is fundamentally shaped and conditioned by our emotions and that deep-seated need for group survival and balance. It's not some pure, detached faculty operating independently. He says reason's role, especially in how we see ourselves and make choices, is always circumscribed, limited, or defined by those basic needs of homeostasis and keeping the group going.
And that raises a really critical question for us, I think. How much of our supposed rational decision-making is actually being guided, maybe even dictated, by the underlying emotional drives and the collective need for stability? Reason, in this view, isn't the boss. It serves the deeper goals set by our emotional context and the need for group survival. Think about big societal decisions, economic policies, resource management, even personal choices about family or community involvement. They're rarely just cold calculations. They're often driven by shared fears, hopes for stability, the feeling of belonging, the instinct to protect. So our rationality in Munoz's framework is always working within the boundaries set by these much older emotional and evolutionary imperatives, making sure our thoughts and actions ultimately support long-term survival and balance.
So, if our raw emotions are like the deep roots, then our advanced brains, our consciousness, don't just reflect those roots. They take those basic impulses and grow this amazing, complex structure: conscious thought, language, imagination. The author describes how the balance of our human life starts deep down, rooted in basic emotional principles. But then these raw signals get processed and refined in the newer parts of our brain, weaving their way into our conscious awareness.
That's a great way to put it. It's precisely there that our emotional and cognitive abilities are truly amplified by reason and consciousness. This higher level processing lets us do more than just react. It allows us to imagine futures, to pause and choose responses wisely, especially in crucial moments. And it allows us to build this incredibly rich world of symbols, language, and shared meaning. It's in these more recently evolved brain areas that we develop foresight, complex communication, abstract thinking, the ability to tell stories that shape who we are and how we understand everything. Our advanced consciousness becomes the peak expression of this continuous rationality, blending raw emotional data with sophisticated symbolic tools to navigate and shape our world in incredibly complex ways. It's that dynamic interplay that makes us uniquely human.
Okay, so we followed this idea that rationality isn't just human, it evolved from animal emotion. It's tied to survival and balance. Where does this ultimately lead? The author suggests rationality didn't just switch on with us, it's been developing gradually. It's woven into life itself, even in simple organisms, driven by that basic intention to just keep going, to endure. He says rational thought emerges from the heart of animal emotion, embedded within the autopoietic order of life. Can you explain autopoietic order?
Sure. Autopoietic means self-creating or self-maintaining. An autopoietic system, like a living cell, is one that continuously produces and maintains itself, its own components, its own boundaries. It's the essence of being alive, self-generation. So when Munoz says rationality is embedded in this autopoietic order, he means it's part of the fundamental logic of how living things sustain themselves and persist. And what's really fascinating here is the implication that rationality isn't some sudden leap unique to humans. It's a process that shows up in degrees across all life. It's implicitly there in the design of every organism. Even a bacterium moving towards food and away from poison is showing a basic logic of survival. It's the inherent logic of life itself: self-regulation, adaptation, the drive to persist manifesting at all scales. And
Then he takes this absolutely huge step. He suggests this kind of ordered process, this rationality, this drive for self-organization and function. It's not even limited to life. What if it extends to the entire cosmos, to stars, galaxies, the fundamental laws of physics? He sees this order extending even into the inorganic realms.
yeah, connecting it to the bigger picture like that is quite profound. It invites us to see order not as just biological or human, but as a fundamental principle woven into the fabric of existence itself. It suggests that the same kinds of organizing principles we see in a cell balancing itself or a city adapting might also be reflected in how galaxies form, how chemical reactions proceed predictably, how the universe itself is structured. It's not just poetry. It implies a deep underlying reason or logic governing reality at every single level. The drive for equilibrium, for ongoing function, for kind of inherent order might be a universal property, not just a feature of living systems.
Wow. Okay, that is genuinely mind-blowing. So he's saying consciousness isn't just in our heads, maybe not even just in living things, but it's everywhere, part of the cosmic fabric. That consciousness, seen as this expression of order and intention, is ubiquitous. That the whole universe has this seamless continuum of consciousness and endless subtle shades.
That's the implication. And it leads to this incredibly deep question. If consciousness is ubiquitous, a fundamental aspect of the cosmos, how does our specific human viewpoint let us perceive this whole grand system as an emotional, rational continuum? How do we grasp it as this continuous logos permeating everything? And that word logos is key here. In ancient Greek thought, logos wasn't just word or reason. It was often seen as the universal divine reason, the underlying principle, the rational structure that orders the entire cosmos. So when Munoz uses it, he's suggesting the universe isn't just ordered. It is an ordering, rational, and maybe even conscious process itself, a continuous unfolding of logic and meaning. Our human rationality, then, isn't separate. It's a local expression, a specific instance, a flow within this universal continuous logos. It implies this incredible connection between our own minds and the vast reality around us, blurring that line between self and cosmos.
What an incredible arc we followed today, seriously. from the basic stability of a cell all the way to the adaptive intelligence of whole societies. Then digging into how our emotions are really the core language of meaning, before ending up with this radical idea of a universe that's inherently ordered, maybe even continuously thinking or feeling, a vast continuum of consciousness. We looked at homeostasis not just in biology, but as this dynamic balance across scales, shaping societies, even our genes. We saw emotions as this foundational layer, predating and shaping our reason, and then this huge idea. Rationality and consciousness, not just human, not just biological, but maybe a cosmic force, a continuous lodos, an inherent logic in reality itself.
It absolutely leaves us with a powerful and maybe unsettling thought to ponder, doesn't it? If rationality isn't just our invention, if it's this unending flow, this inherent logic woven through the entire universe, what does that really mean for us, for our place in it all? How might really internalizing this idea of continuous rationality change how you see your own thoughts, your oceans, your connection to everything around you? Does it hint at some deeper purpose? Or is it more about recognizing an incredibly elegant, self-organizing principle that operates from the quantum level all the way up to galaxies, inviting us to see ourselves not just as rational beings, but as expressions of a universal rationality? Definitely gives you a lot to think about.